So thank you everyone for joining us today for part 6 of the Public Policy Masterclass series. Today's session will be covering policy advisory groups and roundtables. And this session actually came about after the Public Policy 101. If you were part of that, there's interest expressed in having a session specifically dedicated to these topics. So that's why we put this session together. My name is Audrey, and I'm the Public Policy Engagement Facilitator based with the UCL Public Policy team in UCL. If you have any questions, please do put them in the chat. I will be monitoring them. I'm sort of managing both delivering the content as well as the tech side today, so I kind of feel like a bit of an octopus woman trying to manage all of these screens, so just bear with me. But hopefully it should be a good session today, and I've got some rather entertaining exercises as well, so hopefully it should be fun, if I dare say so. I mean, everyone will know the Zoom etiquette by now, so I won't go through this too much. And just to highlight, the session is being recorded. So today I'm going to start with policy advisory groups, cover why you would want to host one, cover the ins and outs and the practicalities of hosting them as well, and then covering what is a policy roundtable, again, why would you host a roundtable, and the ins and outs of hosting one. So we'll start with the policy advisory groups. So what is an advisory group? So it's a collection of individuals who bring unique knowledge and skills which complement the knowledge and skills of the formal board members in order to more effectively govern an organization. I've got an example here of the Mayor of London's Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Group. And so they advise the Mayor, Sadiq Khan, on topics to do with strategic direction for EDI. Go a bit more into the definition. So it's not a formal authority to govern the organization. So any recommendations or advice that the advisory group makes does not have to be formally taken up by the steering committee or the internal members of the team. They're more just there to offer guidance. As it points out here, it serves to make recommendations and provide key information and materials to the formal board of directors. There's other words that could be used to describe an advisory group. It could be called an advisory board, an advisory panel, reference group, advisory committee, or even an advisory consultation committee. And you can have an advisory group that's standing, so that means it's ongoing. They meet at regular intervals throughout over the years for a sort of specific set of time, or there's an ad hoc advisory group, which is just one time where they meet once. And I'll cover later in the slides about why you would want to choose one over the other. Again, if you have any questions, pop them in the chat. So there's a number of reasons of why you would want to form an advisory group. You might want strategic direction and guidance on the work program. So if you have a big project that you're setting up and you just want some advice as to sort of what projects you should put in place, dissemination strategy, who key stakeholders would be to reach out to, then you could set up an advisory group who provide strategic direction on that. You might want some independent, external and policy oriented advice. So if you're looking specifically to have policy impacts or public impacts, then you might want to gather an advisory group together who'd be able to provide some wider ranging advice than just the academics who might be on the internal team. Advisory groups are really useful as well for brokering new partnerships and identifying potential funders. So if you're looking for people who are working in industry, who are working sort of on the ground or in the field, then they'd be able to help make new partnerships for you or identify different funding pots. Just depending on the purpose of your project or department, you might also want to raise the status, prestige, and visibility of your project. So by having an advisory group of senior academics, senior officials, sort of the bigwigs in the field, then the advisory group would be able to sort of lend credibility and big names to your project. You also might just want a sounding board. So when you're doing your research, you might just want sort of an external group of people that you can reach out to, bounce ideas off of, and an advisory board would be able to provide that. So they're also useful for making your academic work more relevant to the real world, so that it's just not, you don't have a project of sort of academics who are entrenched in the research but don't have wider applications beyond that into policy and practice. Or if you have a challenging or current issue that's too complex for sort of the expertise of the internal team to cover, then having an advisory board with external experience might be able to help with that. When would you not want to form a policy advisory group? Well, if it seems like a good thing to do, and if it seems like the funders would really like it and you want to impress them, doing it just for the sake of saying that you have a policy advisory group is not a good idea, because as the second point says, coordinating a policy advisory group well takes a lot of time, capacity, and resources for the internal team. And so if you're just doing this for sort of the face value for the tick box, then it's not going to be the best use of your time and resources, but it's also not going to be the best use of the people that you invite to your board as well, because they're extremely busy. So don't just do it for the sake of doing it. Also, if you don't have a dedicated staff or team member who can sort of play the main role in coordinating the policy advisory group, it's not a great idea to do this, because doing it sort of haphazardly, not doing it well, is going to just cost your project too much. And you also don't want to sort of burn bridges with people who you invite to the policy advisory board. And then if it's just a chaotic mess, then that's not really good for building relationships or reputation. And also, if you don't have a clear purpose for your policy advisory group, so if you don't really know why people are there, then also it's not a good idea to go forward with it. So again, if you can't answer sort of one of these points, whether it's to provide strategic direction, to broker new partnerships, to build status, to act as a sounding board, if you don't have a clear idea in mind, then again, don't go forward with it. You might actually instead want to just put a roundtable together, which I'll describe later on, the difference between the two and also why you might want to choose one over the other. So reasons not to. Then I know people are also asking, well, what's in it for members? Like, we can see clearly why it's beneficial to the project team, but then why is it beneficial for people who you're inviting? Well, first of all, it gives status to people. So if you're inviting retired CEOs or academics or even early career researchers, it does give them status to say that they're an advisory board member for your project. It's also really beneficial for networking with other professionals in the field. So oftentimes policymakers don't have as much accessibility to, they don't have as much access to policy or to industry leaders or to academics. So it gives people in policy sort of ins into those fields, and vice versa. It gives academics the ability to network with people in industry and policy. So it's a really great opportunity for networking for people. It also gives the non-academic members the opportunity to liaise with academics and also have access to resources like academic journal articles, because at UCL, we've got access to pretty much every academic journal out there, but often even policymakers don't have institutional subscriptions to the major journals. And so they might not be able to actually access a lot of like the evidence that's out there. So being able to then have a link in with academia has a very tangible outputs and outcomes for them. And as well, you just want to make sure that there's some kind of benefits for the people in the group. So make it interesting, make the meetings engaging, and I'll cover later on how you can do that. So in terms of the internal coordination, if you're part of a sort of a wider project, or if you're going to just start, if you're just putting sort of a funding grant together, think about the major activities and the time scale of those. So if you have an ongoing project that's over a year, then you probably want to establish a standing advisory group. So that's a group that meets at a set time, at set intervals throughout the year. But if you have short-term activities, or if you just have one sort of problem that you want to resolve, that's less than a year, then you might want to just establish an ad hoc advisory group that meets once, or even just put a roundtable together. And again, the roundtable or the advisory group should be coordinated by someone from the internal team. or through a formal steering committee or nominated a manager or managers. So I'm going to provide some case studies of advisory groups across UCL, and most of the time they're coordinated by one person from within the external team, but then they also sound off with like their director or their line manager as well. In terms of the members of who you invite to your policy advisory group, the ideal size is 5 to 10 people. Anything more than that, and it's a bit like herding cats. So you want a group size that's manageable. You also want to think when you start inviting people to join your advisory group, you want to think about what the purpose is. So again, go back to the why. And so the why will inform the who. So if you're looking more for, so if you want to sort of have policy advice and strategic guidance, you probably want more than just academics on the policy advisory group. So as well as having a couple academics, you'd also want to invite policy professionals or practitioners. If you're looking for sort of advice in terms of partnerships or dissemination, again, you'd want a wider reach beyond just academics. So you might want people with lived experience, as they might have connections with sort of patient advisory groups or with charities. And then you'd also want the practitioners as well, because those are the people working directly in the field. But again, think about what the purpose is, what you're trying to achieve, and then align the membership that way. It's also very important to have a chair, so a strong chair like the very infamous Jackie Weaver. So the role of the chair is to drive the organization and development of the group. The chair will work with the internal coordinators from the internal team to set the agenda and the minutes after the meeting, and also act as a point of contact between the advisory group and the internal coordinators. It's important to have an independent chair. So this means that someone from the internal group, the internal project team who chairs, and most of the time one of the members from the advisory group itself acts as a chair. And if you want to have a policy focus for your advisory group, it's recommended that you have a non-academic chair. Again, so you just have someone who has a wider sort of perspective on the field, as opposed to just someone who's based in academia. When you're putting your members together, you also should have an eye to diversity. So when I did interviews with about 5 different teams across UCL who have advisory groups, and a theme that came out was that they often said that the senior academics many of them have competing demands on their time. And even though it was great to have sort of the top academics in the field, it was actually really hard to get them to engage because they were just so busy. And even getting them together to meet once a year was often a challenge. So then trying to engage with them to sort of read reports throughout the year, to attend ad hoc meetings was really, really difficult. So it's kind of a double-edged sword to have. It's good to have senior academics because they're top in the field, but actually it's really hard to get them to engage because they're really, really busy. So one way that you can get around this is you can still have a couple senior academics, but then often people in industry are a lot more willing and have time to engage. People found that people in industry, so these are people who work for organizations and companies, businesses, they're really keen to participate because it's kind of novel to be involved with this academic policy group, whereas the senior academics, they're already on like 15 of these already, so it's not quite as novel and interesting to them. So people I spoke with really highlighted the value of having people who work in industry and policy on the group. They also recommended involving early career researchers because often the early career researchers are the ones who are actually at the heart of the research and development, and they're often the ones to implement the recommendations made by the group. So not only will early career researchers often have the more capacity to get involved, they'll also be able to really provide contextualized advice because they're the ones who are actually doing the nitty-gritty of the research. And it's also really beneficial for them to have this experience of networking with more senior people, and it'll help them as well gain experience. So it's really quite mutually beneficial. Also try and recruit people with an eye to diversity. So avoid just having the usual suspects, which is code names for old white men. Nothing against them, but it's really good to have a diversity of thought. However, it's really important to avoid tokenism. So tokenism is when you symbolically choose someone from an underrepresented group to kind of check the box of being diverse, but really the intention isn't there. So just keep an eye to that. Also keep in mind that people from underrepresented groups, if they're in fields like science and technology, which are typically quite male dominated, and there's fewer female or women involved at higher seniority levels, often because they're women and people are trying to invite more women to these types of boards, people from underrepresented groups are disproportionately asked to join groups. So it is a bit of a double-edged sword because you're trying to make your groups more diverse, but then if there's a smaller group of people of underrepresented groups to invite, then they might have more demands of them to join these groups. So just keep an eye to that as well. Hopefully that made sense. There's also some tricks for recruitment. So one group really recommended sort of a two-staged approach. So what they did is the internal team identified a small first batch of people to invite to form the initial policy advisory group. So they had 8 people overall, but initially they only invited 4 people. So the internal team discussed this, and then sort of this most senior person, the PI or the director of the unit or team, invited the first 4 people. And then once the first 4 people were in place, they leveraged their networks and asked them, so who do you know, who do you think would be useful to join, who would be valuable additions to the team? And once those members identified those people, then the second round of invitations went out. So that way, the members felt more invested because they felt like they were actually having a role in guiding the development of the advisory group. And it gave the internal team access to people that they probably wouldn't have had if they had just made all of the invitations themselves. So in the chat, I'd like to hear your thoughts. What do you think makes a good advisory group? And a tip here would be to think about what outcomes you're working towards. So just be interested to hear your thoughts in the chat. So one comment would be to have people with the appropriate experience, but also have the time. It's really important that both the members have time, but also that the internal team has time to coordinate as well. Another tip that I heard from people is that early career researchers and people in industry often have more time to engage than the senior academics, but also the senior academics who are retired or just about to retire also have a lot more time because they don't have quite as many demands. So I know it might be a bit more tricky, but if you can find someone sort of in that sweet spot who's senior enough and just about to retire. Other suggestions were having clear aims and objectives. That's extremely important. So you need to have your terms of reference. And in the terms of reference, you'll outline what are the goals, what are the expectations. Having a group where you're not just sharing, but also synthesizing ideas. So that's also really important. Genuine engagement with the issue, exactly. So you're not just, the internal team isn't just sort of giving updates, you actually have engagement, you're asking questions and you're having discussions with the group. Having people with different points of view and that are interested and engaged. So yes, you want that diversity of experience and that background. So that's why having people from policy, industry, academia are really important. So a lot of people are saying people with a range of experience and opinions. So yeah, that's really important. Being aware of conscious and unconscious bias. And having sort of a good existing relationships with some people and then building those with new ones. So yes, that's also really important. So you might have a couple of people that you can sort of rely on at the beginning as you build relationships with other people. And then the last comment about having time to evaluate, and yes, also having the internal team having time to sit back and say, is this working? Is this going well? Do we need to change things? That's really important. Yeah, and you also don't want it to just be sort of an echo chamber. You don't want a table of sort of yes mans. So that's right. You definitely want people who will provide critical advice, feedback, genuine responses. So it's really great. You guys really touched on everything here. So a lot of what is covered on these top tips, you guys already touched on in the chat. So again, only host an advisory group if you have the time and resources to properly coordinate it. A lot of you are saying have clear objectives and goals. And so that's why it's important to have a clear set of terms of reference that outlines the purpose of the group and the expectations of the members. So the terms of reference just shows this is what we expect from you and this is what you can expect from us. So it'll talk about the purpose, the frequency of the meetings, whether they'll be asked to participate in anything in between meetings, and whether you'll have specific tenure. So if people will have a 2 or 3 year tenure, or whether it'll just sort of be open as long as they're interested. Invite a diverse range of members in terms of gender, ethnicity, seniority, and professional background. So again, a lot of you touched on that in the chat. Having people with different backgrounds and experiences is really important. During the meetings, it's important to work with the chair to develop meeting agendas that are engaging, which again, I think so many people touched on, which is great. So you really want a meeting that's not just the internal team running through a list of updates about what they achieved over the year. You actually need to have like, why is the advisory group there? What questions do you need answered? And then ensure that the recommendations from the meetings are incorporated into the program's work. Because if the advisory group makes all these recommendations and then a year goes by, you meet again, and then you find out that, everything that was discussed was basically overlooked and ignored, then they're gonna feel like there isn't really, like, why is it worth them investing their time in this? So it's really important to have some kind of framework and feedback system for people, for the recommendations to then feed into the work. So now I've got 4 case studies of advisory boards from across UCL to give you an idea of the different shapes and forms and functions. And I've got these in the resource document as well, with links to the ones that have public pages, so you can take a look at those. So if anyone is based in the Bartlett, raise your hand if you are, because the Bartlett School of Environment, Energy and Resources has just started their Partnerships and Advisory Board. So it's just got started, and the purpose of this board is to advise the school on strategic direction and support growth. So the activities involve identifying new global trends, facilitating new partnerships and funding opportunities, and providing advice on what types of events to run and reports to create. So again, because it's a pretty broad purpose, they're looking for strategic direction advice. They've got 10 experts from industry, policy, third sector, and academia. So they've got a really broad coverage. They meet 4 times a year, so it's pretty much once a quarter. And that's quite often. The average is probably 2 meetings a year, so 4 is quite often and quite frequent. And it's just difficult sometimes with senior people to organize and try and get everyone together. So that's why 2 times a year is more common. And again, it's not solely to summarize activities, but it's actually to make decisions. So the agenda will cover things like what kind of academics should we be hiring? What funding bids should we be putting together? So challenges that were identified is, again, senior academics are often just too busy to read the background material and engage with the work. But the success is that they use this sort of 2-pronged approach to recruiting members. So they begin with 4, who then leverage their networks to invite an additional 6. And they were able to get ins with people that they wouldn't have been able to otherwise. Next is the Obesity Policy Research Unit. So they're a unit that is funded by the NIHR, and they do all of their work for the Department of Health and Social Care. So the purpose of their advisory board is to provide independent, external, and policy-oriented advice and support the strategic direction. And so because the advice they want is policy oriented, the activities all form around ensuring the work is policy relevant and advising on opportunities for wider dissemination and for translating the research into policy and practice. The members are 8 senior academics, sort of the top academics in obesity research, and the members are invited by the unit director. The chair is the unit director, the unit manager of the internal policy research unit. They meet once a year, and during the meetings, they do an annual review of activities. So they cover, this is what we've done over the past year. The client, DHSE, also attends, and they also do horizon scanning to identify what policy challenges are coming up. There have been some challenges. So there's been a little bit of a misalignment between the priorities of the senior academics on the group and the policies of the priorities of the policy professionals who've actually been commissioning the work. So DHSE will commission a bunch of reviews from the policy research unit, but then the academics will have a completely opposite view as to how that research question should be addressed. So there's a little bit of conflict there. And they also are having a little bit of an identity crisis just in terms of the clarity of the function and the purpose. So right now they're having a little bit of a think about how they can adapt the function so that the members feel more satisfied with the return on investment of their time. The iSense dashboard has an advisory board, and their purpose is to support the sustainability, growth, and development of the project, and to give broader advice on end user needs. So their activities include identifying industry contacts, providing ad hoc advice, and sharing knowledge. And so they've got 7 academics, but then also 1 clinician, because the clinician can advise on sort of the needs of practice and professionals. And again, the chair is one of the members. So they meet annually where they present updates of the achievement and actions against recommendations from the previous meeting. They also develop new recommendations that will be built into their work program for the subsequent year. Their challenges is that they found that because this sort of field is predominantly has men at the sort of the senior ends of the field, given the lack of gender parity, women at senior levels are often disproportionately asked to be on more boards. So it was actually difficult for them to try and get women involved because they're already just on so many other boards. But the successes were that some of the members are very engaged and enthusiastic and have taken on roles beyond the advisory board. So again, if you do have some members that are really keen and really enthusiastic, like leverage that. And if they want to be involved with sort of more of the work, then there's nothing stopping you from sort of building on that enthusiasm. Last example is from the laws faculty, the UCL European Institute. This is the example which is the most different from the other ones. The other ones were more sort of policy and academic oriented, whereas this board, the purpose is to provide strategic advice, broker new partnerships and identify potential funders, but also to raise the status, prestige, and visibility of the European Institute. So the activities involve door opening functions. So that means opening opportunities to people and partnerships, identifying potential donors, chairing events, and topic advice. So because the goal of the group is to raise the status, prestige, and visibility of the EI, they have specifically invited 15 very high-level senior academics, officials, civil servants, and NGO leaders because the seniority of these people align with the purpose of the board. So for example, I know Keir Starmer is actually one of the members. So you can see like they've got sort of the top dogs in the field. They're also a little bit unique in that they meet twice a year. So the first meeting is a business meeting where they present the annual report, discuss questions about what that they want input on, and have strategic discussions. So that one's a bit more standard, but then they also have a second dinner meeting, which is at a fancy private members club where they do have strategic discussions on the institute aims, but they also bring in a distinguished guest speaker, and it allows for networking as well. And so when I was speaking with the coordinator, they said that there's around 60% attendance at the business meeting, but the dinner meeting everyone wants to go to because there's a cool speaker. It's also a great way for them to network with people in a really neat event space. And so they actually have close to 100% attendance at the dinner meetings. Obviously that hasn't happened because of COVID, but in previous years, they found that this sort of mix of like standard, but then also the dinner meeting has really worked. And having the different forms of meetings has kept people interested and makes membership something that people are interested in and enjoy being part of. So they've got a really strong sense of group cohesion and enthusiasm, but as always, they're still trying to sort of iterate different ways to make investment. So for this activity, if you're familiar with fantasy football, I've got a spin on that, but the advisory group edition. So I just want you to pretend you're part of a project team working on a 3-year grant to explore the utility of artificial intelligence for managing emerging epidemics. And the team wants to convene a policy advisory group to advise on routes for policy impact and broker new partnerships. In the chat, I'm including a link to 8 profiles that I've put together. And once you have a look through those, I would just be interested in hearing, you can put it in the chat, you can just put the numbers of who you would choose as your initial 4 and why. And for context, this is actually the topic of a roundtable that I organized on this very topic. It was on AI and emerging epidemics. And the 8 people that I've included in this Google Doc were actually members, or they were actually people who spoke at the roundtable. So once you've had a look at those, just pop in the chat. Who would you choose? Oh, it's not allowing you access. 1 second. Okay, I've updated the permissions, so I think if you just hit the refresh button, you should be able to see it now. Yeah, okay. And I'm just gonna pause the recording as well. Yes, there's an example, a question asking if it would be possible to share an example terms of reference. And yes, I can. In the resource document that I'll provide, I can provide sort of a skeleton or a template. So that's, yeah, thank you for asking for that. I can definitely do that. Are there any other questions? If not, now it's up to you guys. We can move straight on to the policy roundtables discussion, where it'll be similar content and then mini exercise at the end. Or if you'd like a 5-minute break to stretch your legs, make a cup of tea, I'm also happy to do a 5-minute break. So do you want to just let me know in the chat which you'd prefer? So someone said happy to continue. Is everyone else all right with that? Okay, great. So we will move on. You guys have good Zoom endurance. We will go on to the policy roundtables now. So what's a roundtable? Whenever I hear roundtable, I immediately think of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. A policy roundtable is a form of academic discussion where participants from similar fields agree to discuss and debate a specific topic. So each person is given equal right to participate, as illustrated by the idea of a circular layout referred to in the term round table. And so it's not a policy, it's not a panel discussion where there's sort of 3 or 4 people who are speaking with a moderator and everyone else is observing. Everyone who's participating in the roundtable has equal opportunity to speak. They typically involve 8 to 15 people and last from 2 to 3 hours. So pre-2020, you'd be meeting, if you don't have a roundtable, you'd have like a sort of oval set up or just some way where there isn't a clear head. Now, because of COVID, post-2020, a lot of roundtables that have taken place are now virtual on platforms like Teams or Zoom. And I think it's important to highlight the difference between what a policy advisory group and a roundtable is. So I've broken it down into sort of 4 areas where they differ. So first, there's the purpose. So with an advisory group, the purpose is to provide strategic advice and guide the work of the team. Whereas with a roundtable, the goal is to discuss a specific topic. Then the activities also differ. So with an advisory group, they might be facilitating new partnerships and funding opportunities. They might say, oh, well, here's like 5 people that you should reach out to. They might have funding pods. They'll provide advice on what types of events to run. They might actually help you coordinate these events. They ensure work is policy relevant and advise on opportunities for wider dissemination. Whereas with a roundtable, the goal is more to map out a policy topic, research needs, discuss the state of play, and make policy recommendations. So it's a lot more focused on a specific topic, whereas the advisory group is more about the overall running and the function and the organization of your project. The members of an advisory group are going to have broader backgrounds. They might come from wider fields, and the chair is usually one of the members. Whereas with the roundtable, people have more specific backgrounds. So if you were having a roundtable on artificial intelligence and climate change, then you would want to find experts with those specific background, like those specific niche areas in climate change. And the chair is external to the members or the participants in the roundtable. With a policy advisory group, they meet normally at set times every year, so maybe 2 to 4 times a year, or even just once a year, unless it's an ad hoc one-off advisory group meeting. Whereas a roundtable, you meet once for a one-off meeting and discussion. So why would you want to host a policy roundtable? Well, firstly, it allows more people to participate in a policy than in a panel discussion. So you can have more people, 8 to 15 people in active discussion, as opposed to a panel where you might have max 5 people. The more engaging than a lecture style event, because people actually feel like they can participate rather than just sitting and listening. It's also a really great opportunity to bring together leading voices in the field across different sectors to discuss current policy topics. And again, just like with an advisory group where people really benefit from having that networking opportunity, it's similar with the roundtable, because often people from academia, industry, and policy don't have that opportunity to come together and meet across the sectors. So it's a really good cross-sectoral engagement activity. It's also a really great way to map out a policy topic, what the research needs and gaps are, and gather what the state of play and policy recommendations are. So if you're looking to put sort of a policy brief together, or if you're looking to put together a short report, it's really beneficial to host a roundtable discussion, because then you can sort of get the voices and perspectives from across the field into what are the most nascent topics, research gaps, and recommendations that need to be made. So in terms of the practicality, the first step that you need to do is identify a chair. Again, love this woman, Jackie Weaver, very good chair. So the chair will help you frame the briefing paper. So within your topic, what exactly are you focusing on? What are the discussion questions that you want answered? Set the agenda, and then you can also work with the chair to identify the participant list. Who are you going to invite? And they'll also chair the discussion. So it's really important that the chair is knowledgeable, experienced, and well-versed in the topic, because during the discussion, they'll act as a moderator, but they'll also tease out the key themes and the patterns in the discussion. So you need someone who knows the field, who can then sort of marry up all of the points that are being made. You also need to have a strong chair who's able to involve the less confident participants, so the people who haven't spoken as much, invite them to speak. But then you also need a chair who can deter the overzealous members, because in any roundtable, you've always got sort of one or two really chatty Cathy, strong personalities. So you need to be able to sort of bring up the people who are a little bit quieter, but then also sort of dampen down those who are a little bit too vocal. The next step is to work with the chair to set the briefing paper, agenda, and the participant lists. So again, the briefing paper provides the context for the discussion, provides the background information, because if you're talking a wide topic, you need to give people an idea of, okay, what are we actually focusing on? The agenda, there's an example here. It should break down the timings, when the breaks are, and who's speaking when. Ideally, for a 2 to 3 hour virtual event, you'll have 10 to 12 participants. Anything more than that, and it's just too difficult to have time enough for everyone to speak. It's also important to have equal representation from academia, policy, and industry. And just like with the advisory groups, you want to have an idea to ensure gender and ethnic diversity. So I've got 2 slides, one on considerations for hosting a virtual event and one for in-person, because now that the UK is opening up, in a couple months' time, you might actually want to do something in person. So the pros of a virtual event is that it's cheap. You can do it for free. You can invite an international guest list. So because if people aren't coming into a physical location, it's really easy for people from the United States, from South Africa to take part, from across Europe to take part. It's also more accessible. So if people do have accessibility needs, not having to travel to navigate physical infrastructure to be able to have sort of things like live captioning, it is more accessible. Cons is that it's harder to have a large group discussion on Zoom. People find it difficult to concentrate. I know 3 hours over Zoom is a lot more taxing for me than 3 hours in person. You might have technical difficulties like shoddy Wi-Fi. And you also just don't have that sort of organic conversation that takes place over coffee or before or after. If you are going to use virtual, I would recommend Zoom instead of Teams. We've just found that Zoom works a lot better when you have large and wider people from different countries joining in. Some tips for Zoom. For security, enable the password in the waiting room, so that way people can't just sort of Zoom bomb your room. If you have a UCL Zoom account, deselect require authentication to join, because if this is put on, no one outside of UCL will be able to join your meeting, and which is a disaster. And I found out that the hard way. You can also, if you're chairing a Zoom meeting, it automatically makes a chime every time someone joins. You can turn that off. You can also save the chat. So this way, people often do put a lot of interesting information in the chat. You can also auto save the chat so that you can save that for later on. If you're going to do an in-person event, pros is that it's easier to promote discussion in person in large group events. People feel more connected, and you have more opportunities for those spontaneous discussions. Cons, well, it's expensive. So if you're covering people's travel costs, making room bookings, renting equipment, audiovisual equipment, and catering, you would need a budget of £500 to £1,000 just to pay for all of that, to pay for people's train fares. And it'll be really difficult to invite a wide international audience unless you have a massive budget to pay for people's flights. But I'm guessing you probably won't have that. So then in that case, if you were just inviting people from the UK, you'd still be paying a lot of money in train fares and accommodation if people need to stay overnight. If you did want to do something in person, UCL has a massive issue in terms of room space. So good luck to you finding a room to book. You'd want to book your room as soon as possible, ensure that it's accessible. You'd also need to look right away into hiring AV equipment if you're going to have slides, or if you're doing a hybrid event where some people will be there live and others will be streaming in. And you'd also need to set up catering as well, because even if you're just doing a 2 or 3 hour event, you'd still want to provide like coffee and some tea and cakes. So again, you would need a £500 to £1,000 budget to do something in person. So once you've sort of figured out those logistics, whether you're doing it hybrid, in person, or all virtual, then you need to send and manage invitations. So what I've found has worked, and I've put together 7 roundtables now, is having a first string and second string list of participants. Apologies for the sporting analogies. So initially, if I was aiming to have 12 people and at the final roundtable, I would send out invitations to around 25. So that accounts for the people who won't respond to you, those who will but aren't able to attend, and then the ones who do get back to you. And then as you start hearing back from people from your first string, if you're still finding your numbers are low, then you can go to your second string, your second list of people, and start inviting those as well. Invite people individually, so have a individually addressed covering email and then a PDF version of the invitation letter. Don't just send out a generic large group email, even though that might seem like it'll take more time, or that'll be quicker to do. It's less personal and people are less likely to respond. I like to use a spreadsheet to keep track of invitations, so when invitations were sent out and their replies. And then for those who say that they can come, I forward them a diary invitation so that they've got that, and also ask them for a 1-paragraph bio for the program booklet. And after 2 weeks, if I haven't heard from some people, I will go chasing, and often you'll get a couple more replies from that. So as you start hearing back from people, you need to start compiling your program booklet. So this will include a consolidation of the joining instructions, the agenda, the briefing paper, and the bios, because people like to see what the final agenda is going to look like and who else is coming. People are very keen to see who else will be there. You can either hire a designer to design a booklet template, or you can use a free software like Canva. Canva actually has some really great report templates. So that way it's more than just sort of a white Word document. It looks a little bit more professional if you have sort of a nicely designed booklet. And then 1 week before the roundtable, you can send a group email, just put all the participants in BCC, send them a final program booklet in PDF. If you are going to send out a group email, just to be GDPR compliant, put the participants in BCC, CC in the chair, and then address it to yourself. So that way you're not just sharing everyone's emails, because they might not want that. On the day, it's highly likely that 1 to 2 people will drop out. Don't panic if that happens. It's normal and people's schedules change. If you're doing it on Zoom, start the Zoom room 15 minutes early. This way people can test their connections. They can also sort of introduce themselves and chat amongst themselves before you get started. As the host or the co-host, you have the power to change people's names. So what I'll normally go through is I'll rename people, as you can see here in the rename function, so that it's first name, last name, and then their company. Because often you get people like random names like so-and-so's iPad, or just their first name. So this way people know who everyone is. Invite the participants to leave their videos on, but I ask people who are observing to just mute themselves and with their videos off. And then in order to have just a whole bunch of black boxes with people's names if their videos are off, the top icon there will show, you can select the option to hide non-video participants. So this way you don't even know they're there. It's also really important that you have a note taker, or that you get a transcription of the event, which will help with your outputs later on. So you can either use a software like Otter AI, which does live transcription of the meeting, or there's inbuilt transcription functions in Zoom or Teams. So that way afterwards you can access the transcription, or you can use a note taker. So if there's a student or if there's someone from the team, they can also take notes. But whatever function you use or whichever format you use, it's really important that you have someone taking notes. After the roundtable has taken place, it's really important to send a follow-up. So like the day of the event after it's taken place, send an email to participants thanking them for taking part and then notifying them that they can get in touch with you if they want an introduction to any of the other participants. Then also just outline a time frame of when they can expect outputs and what will be expected from them later on. So now the output. So what are you going to get out of this discussion? What are you going to turn the discussion points into? There's a number of different options, but it's really important that the outputs are co-produced with the chair and the roundtable participants. So instead of you just writing all of these things on your own, work with the chair to draft things and then make sure that you send it to the participants for their additions, their comments, and their review. So you can write a policy brief or short report. So I've included a picture here of the policy brief that I wrote after one of my artificial intelligence roundtables. We had it designed so it looks more than just a Word document. You can write a blog. So for example, after another seminar that I hosted, I worked with the panelists and the participants to write a blog that we hosted on the UCL Public Policy postings blog. Blogs are really good ways to communicate the findings and recommendations to wider audiences. You can create an infographic. Again, software like Canva is really useful for giving you tools to visually represent findings and conclusions from an event. You can do a video case study, or you can even do a podcast. So you're not limited to this list. These are just sort of the key ones that stood out to me as things that you might want to do as a result with the findings from your roundtable. Top tips for hosting a roundtable. The first would be define your goals. So what problem are you addressing? What questions do you want answered? And how will you use the information from the discussion? So in your agenda, I would recommend having 2 or 3 key discussion questions that are framing the agenda. Plan your room, whether it's virtual, in-person, or hybrid. Carefully craft the invitation list and choose a strong chair. So again, your invitation list should be diverse and have representation from academia, policy, and industry. Prepare a brief for the other facilitators. So make sure that you're in constant communication with the chair. Meet with them beforehand so that they are clear of what the agenda is and what's being expected of them. Set an agenda and then record, so with the note taking, and then share the results, because participants don't want to sort of be asked to invest 2 to 3 hours of their time and then hear nothing from it afterwards. So make sure that you do have some outputs, and then once these are ready, share these with the participants so that they can circulate these to their wider networks as well. Okay, so before we go on to the activity, are there any questions on roundtables? If not, we can go into the short activity, and if you do have any questions, there'll be time afterwards to go over those. So this activity, I hope it should be entertaining. So I've called it Good Roundtables Gone Bad. So I've got 2 examples, 2 clips of different virtual roundtables, and I want you to think about the strengths and weaknesses of both and why one might be better than the other. And I think I've said it. Oh. And of course, my PowerPoint crashed. So just bear with me, I will restart it. Sorry about that. I will just re-share my screen.
as long as we have reasonable behaviour from everyone. No one.
So here's clip one.
I was thrown out of the meeting. So was Councillor Birkhill, so was Councillor Brereton. Please let the chairman
Mrs. Weaver, please.
If you disrupt this meeting, I will have to remove you from it.
You can't.
It's only the chairman who can remove people from a meeting. You have no authority here, Jackie Weaver. No authority at all.
She's just kicked him out. No, she's kicked him out. Don't. She's kicked him out. Don't.
This is a meeting called by two councillors.
Illegally?
They now elect a chairman.
No, they can't, because the vice chair's here. I take charge. Read the standing orders. Read them and understand them.
Where's the chairman?
So, I mean, you've probably all seen this Jackie Weaver clip by now, but I did think it was an interesting example of a roundtable discussion that needed a little bit of work. Now it's example 2.
Be the Change has a zero tolerance policy for harassment and discrimination. Harassment and discrimination includes, but is not limited to, offensive comments related to gender, gender identity and expression, sexual orientation, disability, mental illness, neurotypicality, physical appearance, body size, age, race, or religion, or lack thereof. This also includes threats of violence, incitement of violence toward any.
Constellation is the largest beer, wine, and spirits company in the United States. James Harris is the Director of Diversity and Inclusion and Supplier Diversity with HEB. As Director of Diversity and Inclusion, Harris develops policy, creates programming, and sets the strategic direction for the company and the 13 regional diversity councils across the state. To keep in mind, as an HEB partner.
So being a force for positive change. And in our experience, and my experience personally, it's only possible to do that when our associates can bring their authentic selves to work each and every day. It doesn't mean that we don't adjust how we show up based on the context, but in the end, if we're not able.
So that's just 2 examples of 2 different roundtables. So I'd be interested to hear in the chat, which one do you think was better and why? And what were the strengths and weaknesses of both? Thinking about the tips that we discussed earlier about how to make a good roundtable. So I think that people are saying that the second one has a respectful environment where effective, clear ground rules were set at the beginning and each person's voice was valued. The agenda had clear objectives and participants. It was inclusive, so you could see in the second clip that there was actually a sign language interpreter, which is even better than having live closed captions. So there was actually an interpreter there. It was inclusive and diverse. People were taking their turns to speak and clear objectives were given at the beginning. It was also very respectful. Yeah, so people are definitely highlighting that the second one was better because it was clear and people were respectful, inclusive, and diverse. Saying that the first had a good chair, so Jackie Weaver was a good chair, but that's the only positive thing about it. Yes, so the first one, I mean, obviously it wasn't set up as a formal academic roundtable meeting, but some things that really stood out to me was the setup of the screen even. It wasn't in gallery view, so that way so with the way that it was shown, you could only see one speaker at a time. Whereas if you're doing a virtual roundtable, you want to be able to see all of the participants. So that way, having it set up in gallery view, that way you can see everyone who's participating. Everyone, if you had noticed in the second one, had changed their name, and it also showed their pronouns. So it had their full name as well as the pronouns, whereas the Jackie Weaver clip, people didn't have their full names, and it might just be like, it was like Alad's iPad. So you might not know who they are, what their affiliation is. The first one, it also wasn't clear. People weren't clear in the first clip on the agenda. People weren't clear on what the authority of the chair was. People weren't clear on sort of the internal regulations that they were working on. So there wasn't any clear objectives. And that's why there was a lot of infighting at the beginning. There's a question saying, what's ideal if the man from example 1 who had interfered with example 2, should they also shut him down? I think if there was an overly sort of abusive voice that came up in the second one, then the chair, I think, would have the right to first call them out and just like remind people of the expectations of behavior. And if his behavior had continued, then she could have removed him from the team, from the meeting as well. The comment saying that the chair in example 1 could have set the rules at the beginning better. Yes, it all seemed a bit chaotic, and I think partially because the participants also just didn't give her time to talk, because I think she had been trying to say what the goal of the meeting was, but people just kept talking over her. So I liked 2 because there was a diverse range of participants. They clearly set out what the objectives were. It was very inclusive because there was actually a sign language interpreter. Their names at the bottom include their full name as well as their preferred pronouns. And the virtual room set up by having the gallery view so that you could see everyone speaking was also a lot better. Whereas with the other one, switching back and forth between a single screen was kind of confusing. So thank you for bearing with me. I really just wanted an excuse to show the Jackie Weaver clip on a presentation, so thank you for that. Are there any questions about roundtables? So there's a question. So there's a question saying, if the roundtable or policy advisory group you organize are not effective as expected, you don't get as many policy recommendations, the debates are ineffective, what kind of steps can you take to fix this? So firstly, I think you can set yourself up for success. So if you have a really good chair, if you work with the chair ahead of time, whether for the roundtable or the advisory group meeting, to set out what the agenda is, to have a very clear set of discussion questions or topics that you want to cover, having a clear and really tight agenda will sort of set you up for success and have greater likelihood of the discussion being fruitful. So my first suggestion would be make sure that you've got a really useful agenda, make sure that you know who you want speaking, who you want introducing the topics. And that way you most likely are going to have the useful discussions. But even after all of that, if you've set up a really great agenda, but then the discussions just aren't quite as useful as you'd hope they would be, you can still sort of put a blog piece together that's a bit more descriptive and narrative as opposed to synthesizing a discussion or making recommendations. So you could put a blog together saying, this event took place, this is what was discussed, this is where we're taking it from here. You could put an infographic together. So you might not, and then you might want to do sort of more individual follow-ups with people. There's another question asking, could you say a bit more about how roundtables might fit into the wider research cycle, e.g. to feed into a funding bid? Yeah, so you could have, so if you're doing some roundtables, you could do a series of roundtables. So you could have a discussion pre-funding bid, that would be focusing on the research gaps and the research needs. So then you could say in your funding bid that you organized sort of a focus group together, a roundtable together of leading voices, academics, practitioners in the field, and they identified these top 3, 4, or 5 priorities. So then it could feed into the funding bid. And then at a later stage in the project, you could have another roundtable to discuss some of the key findings and the interpretations of those findings. And then you could have another roundtable at the end where you're talking again about like the key findings and sort of where the next, what the policy implications of that would be. But if you're thinking about having meetings running throughout the cycle, then it might actually be more beneficial to have sort of a policy advisory group instead of roundtables, because in the advisory group, you could work with them throughout the life cycle of your project. There's another question asking, do you think a clinician researcher is too busy to be a chair? I think it really depends on the individual. So you would have to just have a very open and frank conversation with them. It'd be helpful probably if you could put to them sort of how much work would be expected of them. So you could say, you know, I'm approaching you to see if you would have capacity and interest in being a chair for my roundtable. I would expect we would need to meet X amount of time. I will draft the agenda and briefing paper, but you would need to review this. So set out sort of what the work expectations would be from them, and then they can say whether they would be busy or not. So I've had that as well. I've had people say, oh, you know, I'm not like an expert in this area. I also don't have capacity. But if that's the case, then ask, well, could you recommend a colleague or someone else who might be able to? So if they're too busy, ask them for a colleague. But I don't think you can make a decision from the outset without speaking with the person whether they're too busy, because they'll know their schedule. Are there any other questions? Or hopefully I've answered the ones that have come up. I also just wanted to very briefly cover UCL public policy. I know if you've been to our sessions in the past, you probably know what we're all about. Very briefly, if this is your first time attending one of the sessions, we offer routes for public policy engagement. We offer training like this Masterclass series, but we also offer bespoke guidance. So if you have any questions about putting a roundtable together, or if you're interested in putting together an advisory group, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm very happy to set up a meeting and discuss this with you in more detail. The last session in the Masterclass series, part 3, which was Introduction to Public Engagement, had to be rescheduled. So it's in 2 Tuesdays, Tuesday the 8th of June, 10:30 to 12:30. It's with my colleague, Ben Littlefield from the public engagement team. And this will be a really, really good session because it's talking about how to develop your pitch and pitch your research to public audiences like other researchers, the public, and as well as policymakers. So if you're looking for some tips and advice on how to craft your research and communicate it with wider audiences, I would really recommend that you register for this event, because it's going to be really, really useful and really hands-on as well. And I know Ben is a really good facilitator and presenter, so highly recommend that you attend that. And I'm just going to include the link to register for that here. So the link to register is available in the chat now. So if there aren't any other questions, it'd be really, really helpful if we could get your feedback. Again, it's just like a 2-second survey that I've put together. So I've also included the link to the survey in the chat. And oh, sorry, the 2 links kind of have merged into one blur, but they're both there. So the first link is for the Eventbrite for the last session, but then there's also the feedback survey. So it'd be really great to get your feedback. This was also the first time I've delivered this session. So if I'm going to hold it again, it'd be really great to get feedback on how we can improve it moving forward. And again, if you have any other questions, don't hesitate to get in touch. All of our links are here. You can follow us on Twitter. You can email me. If you're interested in finding out more about training opportunities, funding opportunities, policy engagement activities, I would highly recommend you register for or sign up for our monthly newsletter because it's sort of a one-stop shop there. If not, I'm